All right, wonderful. Well, good evening, and thank you to everyone for joining me here tonight. My name is Beth Vanderkoy. I'm the Executive Director of Greater Columbus Right to Life, and tonight we have the third episode, or the third in the series of the Building a Culture of Life conference. So, sorry about that. I want to welcome you all here, and I want to share a little bit about the Building a Culture of Life conference. We've been doing it, a little bit different this year. Like so many things, COVID has kind of shifted how we're doing this. So if you've missed the first two episodes, you can actually go to our website at bclc.life and you can watch them. The first show was on raising the pro-life generation, and it was sponsored or hosted by the Office for Marriage and Family Life. The second was a program on walking with moms in need, hosted by the Office for Social Concerns. And then this third, kind of walking through the progression, is making end-of-life decisions, and also a review of our new resource here at Greater Columbus Right to Life, Faithful at the End of Life. So a few notes before we begin. This is a live stream, and it will be made available on our website. So we have probably most people joining us via Zoom, and we'll have some people on Facebook Live. Hopefully that's running. For those of you who are participating via Zoom, if you can keep any questions that you have via the question and answer tab, as opposed to the chat screen. It's a little more difficult for me to monitor the chat screen as we go along. I will be monitoring it, but I can't answer it quite as quickly. I will try to answer questions as we go to make this a little bit more interactive. I know for many of us, the very last thing we want is yet another Zoom at the end of our day. So I really appreciate that you're all here. I also want to let you know that we have set up some polls, and over the course of the evening, you're welcome to respond to these polls. The first poll is launched now, and we'll leave that up for about the next 10 or so minutes. As always, keep it clean and respectful. And how we do here at Greater Columbus Right to Life. If there's anyone who's not abiding by our community standards, we'll remove you. So with that, I would like to begin everything as we do here at Greater Columbus Right to Life in prayer. So if you can join me. Heavenly Father, we thank you for our salvation in Jesus Christ and for the call he gives us to stand victorious against the culture of death, which he has conquered. We ask that you be with us in a special way tonight and at the hour of our deaths, that each moment be infused with a joy that only you can give. May we, your people, continue to proclaim your truth and share your grace within our homes, our churches, in the media, in the voting booth, and in every inch of the public square. Tonight, we humbly pray that as we seek you, we will find you, and as we seek to change the world, that we ourselves will be changed, so that in our effort to build a culture of life, we will find life eternal. We pray all this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Awesome. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. So hopefully everybody can see. I'm trying to do a two-screen, so you should be able to see me and also see the share slides. If you are really wanting some of these share slides and you happen to miss them, if you go onto our website at bclc.life, like building a culture of life.life, the slides are all up there that you can review. So I think probably everybody here is familiar with the mission of Greater Columbus Right to Life. We work to build a culture that protects innocent human life from conception until natural death. And when most people think of us, they think of abortion. But increasingly, the pro-life movement is working to respond to challenges at the end of life. And this really comes in three main areas. The first is in legislation and legal. So the push for assisted suicide and euthanasia in some places where there's concerns with MOLST or POLST orders, that's an acronym that stands for Medical or Physician's Order for Life-Sustaining Treatment. The second area is difficulty understanding ethical decision-making at life's end, right? And then the third is obtaining and executing life-affirming advanced medical directives. Tonight, we're really looking at the second two areas. If you are interested in scheduling a program or bringing a program to your church, either in person when that is appropriate or via another webinar like this, whether that's on assisted suicide or euthanasia or any of the pro-life apologetics talks that we give, you can go to our website at gcrtl.org/speaker, and there's actually a request for a speaker. The other sort of housekeeping thing that I want to make very, very clear is I'm not your attorney. I'm not giving anyone legal advice tonight. So if you have legal questions or if you have specific legal questions, that really is something that you have to direct to an attorney. I can provide general educational information, but I can't really provide legal advice. I'm not an attorney. So the foundation of what we're talking about tonight is that this understanding that we are stewards and not owners of the lives which God has entrusted to us. So that really is foundational. And that means that no person has the right to intentionally take innocent human life, not their own and not another, right? And so this really is the basis of both theological and secular approaches to the dignity of human life that would espouse a pro-life ethic, right? As a friend of mine once quoted a movie, I know there is a God and I am not him. But something that I think is really important for the pro-life community to understand is that being pro-life doesn't mean we're obligated to preserve life at all costs. Sometimes I will get calls from people and, they're really upset that maybe somebody in their family who's very ill, they're slowly declining, they're not eating anymore, they're just in what we would consider the natural process of dying. Which is difficult, don't get me wrong, but we're not obligated to preserve life at all costs. Sometimes this is called a vitalist perspective. And remember, as pro-life people and as Christians, we work to live our lives here on earth in a way that brings us and others closer to God, but we also realize that death is not the end. And so on end-of-life ethics, just like in every single other ethical issue, we look at the object, the intention, and the situation to determine if an action is ordinary or extraordinary in the moral sense. I just had a question about hospice, and if that's okay, I'm going to pause that question. I will answer it, but I'm going to pause it until a little bit later in the talk when I might actually cover what you are asking. But in general, hospice and palliative care are both ethical things as long as we abide by the standards that are setting here, right? So we'll talk about these a little bit, and then we'll flesh that question out a little bit. So in the terminology that we're going to be using it tonight, remember that anything which we determine as ethically ordinary care is care which is obligated. And extraordinary care is care which is not obligated in a moral sense. Okay? And unlike at the beginning of life, it's very easy, right? If you're pregnant, it's a baby, and we don't support abortion. But end of life, there isn't an exhaustive laundry list or a checklist of what is ordinary and what is extraordinary treatment. And again, I'll talk about this in a little bit, but you have so many different medical situations and so many different patients that rather than saying if A, then B, what we try to do is we try to establish a hierarchy for decision making that helps us to understand these ethical issues. So something else that I want you to understand as well, and unfortunately this causes a lot of confusion. It causes confusion in other areas. It causes confusion in abortion apologetics as well. But the words ordinary and extraordinary have different meanings when they're applied to bioethics than they have in everyday usage or even in the medical field. And at the end of this, I'll direct you to our book where I go into this and explain it a little bit more. But they have different meanings. So when we're talking about it from an ethics perspective or a bioethics perspective, ordinary means of conserving life are those means commonly used in given circumstances, which an individual in his or her present physical, psychological, and economic condition can reasonably employ with a definite hope of proportionate benefit. Now that's a mouthful, but what ordinary really means is it beneficial to the patient? Will it benefit the patient in some way? Extraordinary means then are those acts that are not commonly used in given circumstances, or those which an individual in his or her present physical, psychological, and economic condition cannot reasonably employ, or if he or she can, it doesn't give them a definite hope of proportionate benefit. Again, this is another mouthful. But in other words, what this means is something which is burdensome to the patient. All right, Wanda, I see your question on medical personnel when they differ with ethically ordinary care. I'm also going to put a pin in that one, not because it's not a great question, it is, but because we will actually talk about that in just a minute. So extraordinary means burdensome to the patient. Okay. So for those of you who are listening who may be Catholic, the Catholic Church has a plethora of resources, but one very definitive statement comes from the Ethical and Religious Directives for Catholic Healthcare, and it explains that a person has a moral obligation to use ordinary or proportionate means of preserving his or her life. Proportionate means that those that are in the judgment of the patient, they offer a reasonable hope of benefit and do not entail an excessive burden or impose expensive expense on the family or the community. So some of what this means is if you have a rare condition, you certainly should pursue all treatments that are possible. But you are not ethically obligated to bankrupt your family in order to preserve your own life. That's not required, right? And we see this standard that also makes sense. Unfortunately, in a perfect world, every single person would have access to top shelf medical care. But we know, just prudentially or pragmatically, that the care that might be available to someone in close proximity to Columbus, Ohio, or Cleveland with the university health systems and the clinic, the Cleveland Clinic, that might be a little bit more expansive than somebody maybe in a remote Western state. And that is certainly very different than somebody who can access healthcare in a collapsing economy like Venezuela or somewhere in the third world. So you still have to provide the best care possible, but it's not unethical. It's, to use a phrase of an old boss of mine, it's not unethical if you're not driving the Cadillac, right? You can get there in a less expensive car. You can get there in the Honda, right? To use a Central Ohio concept. And while it's difficult, I always get really, I'm always really cautious about saying, well, Catholics say this and Protestants say that, because obviously there are so many Protestant perspectives, but what we've tried to do is identify those that are in common. And so when I took a look at this from kind of a consensus Christian teaching on end of life, I used a resource from Focus on the Family. And it basically says the same thing. A pro-life philosophy on medical decision-making presumes intervention will be attempted to preserve a patient's life as long as the intervention is determined to be physiologically possible for the patient, offer an expected benefit without excessive risk or burden, and provide reasonable hope of sustaining or improving the patient's life. So really, it's two ways of saying the same thing. So it seems pretty obvious what we mean when we talk about a benefit, right? But when we talk about a burden, it can be a little bit more complicated. And so ethically, there have traditionally been 4 standards used to determine burden. The first is excessive pain. You are not ethically obligated to go through excessive pain, particularly when there isn't a proportionate benefit. You are not required to use grave effort. I have allergy-induced asthma. It is possible that if I moved to a place with a more steady climate than Columbus, Ohio, I would do better in the fall and in the spring when my allergies run amok. But I'm not ethically obligated to move my life, and I'm not ethically obligated to move to Scottsdale, Arizona for my health. Intense fear or repugnance. This one, I have a friend, and hopefully he won't get mad at me for using his example, but he's in probably his 60s, and he has had some heart problems. And he's had a series of heart attacks, and his doctor has told him that if it keeps going like this, within a few years, he'll be on a transplant. He does not want to have a cardiac transplant. He finds it, he just doesn't want to go through that. He doesn't want to put his family through that. He is not ethically obligated to undergo a transplant if he intensely fears being in an operating room. And the last is great cost. Like I said, you're not obligated to bankrupt your family in order to pursue the latest possible cure. You're okay to do that. And I want to be very clear that we're not talking about healthcare rationing here. I'm talking about what you are required to do as an individual to preserve your life or the life of the person you're making decisions for, okay? So things are not always cut and dried. We make decisions by weighing the benefit and the burden to the patient. And we know that these words can sometimes have different understandings. And so to get back to that previous question, what do we do when we differ with the doctor? I'd say the very first thing we do is we clarify terms, right? And then we get a second opinion. And we remember that practicing medicine is always a work between the physician and the patient's advocate, whether that's the patient or a family member. So that's when sometimes it's really helpful to have very good documents on your side and very good resources on your side. And that really is why we're doing this, because most people don't have a lot of experience in talking about this. So like I said, you want to get as much information as possible, including a second opinion. You want to consult people who share your values. Maybe that's your pastor. Maybe that's the Catholic Medical Association. Maybe that's the National Catholic Bioethics Center. Maybe that's Focus on the Family. Maybe that's the Christian Healthcare Association. And you want to make sure that you're explaining your thinking to physicians and nurses caring for the patient, because one, you're evangelizing too, but also you need to make sure that you're not talking beyond each other, right? So often, and I find this even in my good friendships, we'll be having a disagreement, and then 10 minutes later, we'll realize that we're disagreeing because we've defined terms slightly differently. So I always encourage you to ask questions. What do you mean by this? You know, okay, well, here is what I mean by ordinary. I mean, I want it to benefit the patient. When you're talking about ordinary, what do you mean? Because a doctor might have a very different definition of ordinary. So it's something that is commonly done and expected to have a positive outcome, right? That's the medical terminology. And then something else to remember is that critical care is stressful for physicians and nurses and medical staff as well. There's a difficulty between being firm and being run over and being difficult. And that's something, you know, I've been that person. It's really, really hard sometimes to hit that happy medium. But I keep going back to this, unlike abortion, which is always wrong, decision-making on end of life is going to vary from patient to patient, given his or her medical situation. How we treat and how we can reasonably expect to treat a 38-year-old with a cancer diagnosis is very different than how we will treat a 98-year-old with a cancer diagnosis. And not because one of them is more valuable than the other, but because the younger person might have a different outcome or might have, you know, more options. And, you know, the older person may not want to put themselves through that. They may just want to live out the remaining days that they have with their loved ones. And this is why, really, two things. It's important that we talk about these things more as a culture and more as a society, but it's also really important that we have designated somebody to speak on our behalf when we cannot speak on our behalf. Okay? I'm gonna end that first poll, by the way. And I think I'm going to launch our second poll. All of our polls, by the way, are anonymous. So in my second poll, I'm asking why you're joining tonight, and we'll give this one another 10 minutes. And I skipped ahead a little bit there. I'm sorry. I'm going crazy. So something else to keep in mind is that there are start and stop issues. So if a treatment is ordinary, it must be given, right? And it should not be stopped unless you've reevaluated if it still meets the benefit versus a burden stance. I have a good friend who just went through this with a family member. He was undergoing cancer treatment, and he was getting some he was getting a secondary treatment, right? He was getting a secondary treatment to try to make the cancer treatment work better, and it just wasn't working. And so he and his family made the decision that he wasn't going to do that anymore, because it meant pulling him out of the room for 4 hours and going through a complicated medical situation. So you can evaluate if If a treatment no longer meets the benefit versus the burden, it is perfectly ethical to start it or to stop it. So not all treatments must be started, and those which are started can be stopped if they meet the standard of a burden. If it's no longer helping the patient, or it's no longer going to be more of a benefit than it is a burden. So one of the most common end-of-life scenarios that people have questions about is when a DNR is appropriate, right? And I'm going to define these terms in a little bit, but I think everybody knows what a DNR is. So the question that we would ask is CPR, either cardiac or pulmonary, is it ordinary or is it extraordinary? And again, keeping in mind that we have different meanings here. And the answer 100% depends on the circumstances. If I'm walking down the street, and maybe I've had a little too much to drink, and I fall into a pond, and a Good Samaritan pulls me out and I'm not breathing, absolutely give me CPR, right? That's the ordinary treatment. It's my best chance. If there's somebody there who can perform it, they should perform it. Now, it shifts a little bit. Let's say that I'm someone who has a heart implant, and I can't have the word's escaping me right now, the diodes on my chest, I can't get shocked in, or I have a very brittle bone disease and I'm in the hospital. It might be appropriate to talk to my doctors and nurses to say, okay, if you have to do any of that, you have to know where to place the sensors, and you can't push too hard, because the benefit of giving those chest compressions may not exceed the burden of how much pain that might cause me, right? And it is okay to allow a dying person to die. And this is really hard. And I try not to use overly personal examples, but I'm going to use this one. A few years ago, I was my dad's healthcare power of attorney. He was dying. He had a terminal cancer diagnosis. He had a bone cancer that had metastasized to his lung. And he went into the hospital for a routine procedure, routine x-ray even, and it was just a really bad day, and everything that could go wrong went wrong. And he was given a problematic medicine, and then he was like, they tried to resolve it, and they put him upside down, and fluid rushed into his heart and into his lungs, causing him to have a cardiac episode and a pulmonary episode. And so with my dad, because he had lung cancer and metastasized lung cancer, we were prepared that he most likely would die of pneumonia, right? But in this situation, the pneumonia wasn't caused by his cancer. It was caused by something outside of his condition. And so making the decision, I was the decision maker, and I said, no, we're going to intubate him. We're going to give him supplemental oxygen. We're going to remove this. We're going to remove the fluid from his lungs. We're going to see how he does. So over the course of about a week, we did this. We weaned him off the intubation. We extubated him. And it was a very difficult process for him. He weakened a lot. And we knew he probably only, in a best case scenario, he probably only had a month, maybe a little bit more to live. We were actually planning to move him into a hospice situation the next day when this all happened. And so we had a conversation with him, and I said, what do you want us to do if this happens again? And he said, you know what? I've lived a good life. My children have been here with me. I can't ask for any more. And so that night, before I left, I signed his DNR. And I signed that because if I didn't sign that DNR and he coded again, the hospital staff would have been required to attempt to resuscitate him. So that was 100% an example where a DNR was absolutely appropriate. And I also think, and this is so hard, I don't know if any of you watch the television shows with the doctor shows, but media has given us a really unrealistic understanding of CPR. And so keep in mind that it is okay to have a DNR when it will no longer proportionally benefit the patient, when it will be a burden to him or her. It's so hard. It is 100% the hardest decision I've ever made in my entire life. And I'm saying this as someone who answers phone calls all of the time when people have these questions. It was hard for me, but it was the right decision. Okay. So another common end-of-life scenario is food and water. And this is something that is actually very, very important within the pro-life community. So generally speaking, food and water, or nutrition and hydration, are ordinary care and must be provided. And I'll talk about this a little bit in a minute, but this is something that is really problematic about our current setup and the current standard form healthcare power of attorney. And it's one of the most common questions that we get. If someone is in a permanently unconscious state, someone like Terry Schiavo, food and water should be provided to them. Now, in very rare occasions, it is appropriate to withhold or withdraw food and water. For example, if a person can no longer safely assimilate it, there actually comes a point in the dying process when their stomach will stop, their body will stop absorbing the nutrients and absorbing the water. And so in that case, you don't have to feed them or give them artificial hydration. Although in common scenarios, usually an IV is very simple, and they maintain an IV just as a matter of practice. And also, sometimes patients stop eating and drinking as part of the natural dying process. A good example of this is at the end stages of cancer. If someone is dying, and they're going to die within a few hours to a few days, you don't have to put in the nose feeding tube, or certainly not a stomach feeding tube. But if there's somebody who would otherwise live, we never want their cause of death to be dehydration or starvation. Okay? One of our most common questions. I'm going to pause real quickly, check the, yes, thank you, Dr. Lutter. Defibrillator was the word I was looking for. A little bit earlier when I was saying I couldn't think of the word for CPR, the defibrillator. So when we talk about end-of-life documents, we're really talking about a category of things called advanced directives. So the first one that most people are probably familiar with, and you might have one, and that is a living will. And again, I am not your attorney, but your pro-life attorney and Greater Columbus Right to Life, and the consensus of almost every single pro-life organization, is that you should not have a living will in the form that Ohio sets. In some states, it might be a little bit different, but in Ohio, we highly recommend people do not have a living will, and if they have one, they revoke it. Instead, what we recommend is a durable power of attorney for healthcare. Okay? Those are both advanced directives. Another form of an advanced directive is a DNR, right? Another form of an advanced directive is an organ donation declaration. So if you've been to the BMV and you've put that little sign on your driver's license. And then the last form, and I'm not going to talk about them a ton. We don't have them in Ohio, but I do like to mention it because it's a policy issue that is somewhat contentious in the pro-life world, and that's a POLST or a MOLST, or a physician's order for life-sustaining treatment. It's kind of like halfway between a living will and a DNR, is a good way to put it. So when we talk about the living will, Ohio's living will is a document that applies in two scenarios only. The first is you are in a permanently unconscious state, or you are terminally ill and death will occur in a relatively short time. And in these two instances, a living will is interpreted by your doctor, and it states that in these two instances, all treatment should be withheld or withdrawn if it's begun. It mandates that your physician administer no life-sustaining treatment, including CPR. It orders that he or she issue a DNR order. And the standard is to order a withdrawal of hydration and nutrition. And there is no opportunity to weigh the benefit versus the burden. In summary, a piece of paper determines, not your person. And what a lot of people don't realize is that if you have a healthcare power of attorney and one of those two instances kicks in, your healthcare power of attorney no longer has any say. Okay? So a lot of people sign a living will thinking that it will keep them from being kept alive artificially, or that it will be a message to their agent that they don't want to be kept alive artificially. And that's not what it says. It orders these things. So in Ohio, we actually have something called a durable healthcare power of attorney, and you're probably more familiar with this. It names a person called your agent to make decisions for you when you are unable to do so. It lists people in a specific order, and healthcare personnel will follow the order of people named to make decisions for you. So for me, the first one is my sister. And if she's not available, my mother. If she's not available, a very good friend. The healthcare power of attorney authorizes your agent to get medical information, and it applies anytime you're unable to make decisions. So a few years ago, I had to have a tumor removed from my head. And when I went into surgery, we gave them my healthcare power of attorney. And then we knew if I was under anesthesia and something happened and somebody had to make a decision, my sister would make it on my behalf. So she doesn't have that authority when I'm able to make decisions for myself. It's only when I'm not, regardless of the reason. Okay? And something I really want to emphasize is that a healthcare power of attorney is not just for older or sick individuals. It's not just for parents of young children. Every single person over the age of 18 should have one. Under 18, or if you're a legal guardian of somebody maybe with diminished capacity, they will make the decisions. There is statutory authority, but it only applies in cases of terminal illness or permanent unconsciousness. So in that example, like where I'm having surgery, the hospital decides. And the hospital decides who will make the decision. And as we've gotten more litigious and as HIPAA has expanded, it really, really can be problematic. And we've seen examples of that happening here in Ohio. The son of a family friend of another leader in the pro-life movement, they actually had a situation where he and his buddies were taking a trip to Cedar Point. They just turned 18. They were T-boned by an intoxicated driver, and the young man was hospitalized. Well, because he didn't have a healthcare power of attorney, the hospital was saying they didn't have any authority to share his medical information with his parents. And it ended up being a whole thing. And so every single person should have a healthcare power of attorney. And you want to talk to the people you make as decision makers about your values and your intentions. And you want to sign a good healthcare power of attorney that reflects those values. So a few things to keep in mind. You don't have to name a family member, although many people do. Every legal adult should have one. It ensures that a person is not making decisions on your behalf, as opposed to ordering that a doctor make decisions on a piece of paper that you never considered. In that example I talked about, if my dad would have had a living will, it wouldn't have mattered that his condition wasn't caused, his pulmonary problem wasn't caused by the progression of his disease, but by a medical error. They would have most likely been bound by that DNR declaration in the living will. And something that's really unique and special about the Greater Columbus Right to Life document is that you can give broad or narrow powers. So for example, you can let your agent know if you'd like to be attended to by a Catholic priest or a pastor or minister in your faith. You can include things like resources. I'm Catholic, my family is not. So I have in my healthcare power of attorney that my sister should contact the diocesan bioethicist and the National Catholic Bioethics Center if there's any questions. You can point your agent to resources and individuals like I did. The next directive is a DNR. It's a physician's order that essentially says if you don't want actions taken, or if your heart stops beating, or if you stop breathing, so cardiac or pulmonary arrest, that they shouldn't do anything. So that's going to include anything from mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to chest compressions. And in Ohio, this is a little technical. We actually have two types of DNR. One is a DNR comfort care, and so that's non-aggressive care. So certain things are prohibited, but certain things are allowed. And the second is called a DNR comfort care arrest. And so this is full care until the point of arrest. You get everything until you experience that cardiac or your pulmonary arrest. And then comfort care obviously is any action taken to promote the patient's comfort. So pain medication, emotional support, etc. Organ donation, this can be a very tricky thing. So organ and tissue donation can be a very pro-life effort. As St. John Paul II said, it fulfills the mission of medicine and has allowed many people to live beautiful lives. But it's important that some definitions of death may not be the same as the moral definition of death that you understand it, particularly with Catholics. And I'm not trying to make a distinction here, but Catholics have a very rigorous body of ethics and science on this. In my experience, Protestants tend to have less developed resources and theology on that particular issue. I'm always glad to be corrected, but until then, we recommend resources like the National Catholic Bioethics to anybody and talking to your clergy. So something that you should realize is that Ohio allows an individual to register to become a tissue donor at the BMV, online, or by filling out and mailing in a registration card. And amending or revoking is the same process. If you are registered as a donor, this is not an expression of your wishes to your family. It is a contract between you and Donate Life Ohio. And there have been some difficulties where families and Lifeline of Ohio have gotten into disagreements about if somebody was really dead. And Lifeline of Ohio has won those. So what we recommend is that if you wish to be an organ or tissue donor, that you discuss those wishes with your agent rather than signing that contract. One last thing is that Ohio law provides that you can't be required to sign a living will or a power of attorney in order to receive healthcare services. Every once in a while, we hear that somebody's told they have to sign these before they can have surgery, and that is not true. Know that if you have a DNR or a living will, it will trump your healthcare power of attorney every single time, absent legal action that is probably not going to succeed. You don't want to be going to court over a DNR or a living will when your loved one is in the ICU, full stop. So have a healthcare power of attorney and revoke that DNR. And I'm running a little bit over, I apologize. But that brings us really to what we're launching today or this week at Greater Columbus Right to Life, which is Faithful at the End of Life, a resource. And what we have really tried to do is to merge these basic pro-life ethics on end-of-life healthcare with an advanced medical directive and healthcare power of attorney as a one-stop shop. It is a free resource. It conforms with Ohio's law on standard form healthcare power of attorneys. It meets the ethical standards of the pro-life faithful. You can execute it with or without the assistance of an attorney. You can take the form, attorneys can execute it on your behalf, or you can fill it out and have it witnessed and notarized. We actually have two versions of the form. One is specifically targeted toward a Catholic audience and has been reviewed by diocesan bioethicists. And the other one is more for a general faith-based audience, a general Christian or a general Protestant audience. So we've gotten a few questions about why we've done this. And why we've done it is that Ohio has a current standard form that's supported by many groups like the Bar Association, the Hospital Association, the Medical Association, and it represents the consensus by these groups. It's not a bad document for the healthcare power of attorney, but it can be very confusing in some areas, and it's packaged with the living will in a way that's misleading and challenging. And so what we've found is that many religious and pro-life people have concerns with the provisions. They find it doesn't meet their needs. Customizing it is expensive. And most attorneys aren't trained on faith and bioethics, right? Even here in Central Ohio, I can think of 2 or 3 that could really execute a great document for you. So the benefits of our version is you can include language that revokes all prior living wills and prior documents. You can be more specific about food and water, or if you're a woman of childbearing age, what to do if you should be pregnant. It can authorize your agent to decide what terms mean. You can specifically direct that your life not be ended by assisted suicide or euthanasia. You can reject treatments that use tissues from an induced abortion. You can specify the ethical situations when you want to reject or accept a particular treatment. And it can limit your agent's authority in important ways, i.e., your agent doesn't have the authority to approve the direct and intentional ending of your life. And for most people, they hear that and they think, well, I would never choose an agent who would support that. But it also protects your agent from being pressured to authorize such an action, right? Most healthcare professionals are wonderful and they 100% want to see all of their patients live long and happy lives. But sometimes you get someone who maybe has a different perspective, and this gives your agent a little bit more teeth to fight back if there's something, the question is, what if we disagree? Well, how you disagree is you put it in writing that your agent can't approve that procedure that you disagree with. And so we have 3 stages of deployment for pro-life at the end of life. The first is for use by individuals, families, and churches. And you can go online tonight at faithfulattheendoflife.org, and you can look at the copies and you can download it and you can download the forms. The second stage of development is for use by attorneys for their clients. It's available immediately for attorneys who want to customize their clients. And we're also working to develop attorney CLE courses and a list of lawyers who will offer the document with the standard forms and have been through our training. And then we really hope within the next year or so to offer legal clinics where people can come in. The forms are available at www.faithfulattheendoflife.org. And it's on there for both Catholic and non-Catholic clients. And in fact, let's see if I can do this. I'm going to try to get fancy here. I'm going to, hopefully you're seeing, I just opened it up. Oh, I think this is like the version for me as somebody who is constantly editing the page. But if you go to our homepage at faithfulattheendoflife.org, oh, it might not be let. Oh yeah, it's letting me. There's a welcome page, and right there, go to downloads. And when you do that, we've got them separated. So the first section is the Catholic edition. The second section is the general edition or the general Christian edition. And then the third section is for forms only. So maybe you don't want all of the pages with all of the ethical information. You just want to take a look at the form. And what we've done is we've done this so you can preview before you download. And hopefully you can see this. But we've got the instructions. There's a little section for notes. And then it gets right into the advanced directive form. And if you download this from the website, here, let me shrink it again. If you download it from the website, so again, just because it's a little bit smaller, I'm using the form-only version. We've actually made this really user-friendly. And in fact, you could go right here and you can just fill in your PDF. And you can fill it all in. And then you can get down, so you go through all of the sections and you want to read them carefully. And if you have questions, you know, if you disagree with something, you can mark it out. But you get all the way through it. And then we've included addendums, right? You don't have to sign any of the addendums, but you're welcome to. Sorry, I'm still scrolling to get to the addendums page. It's a little bit long. Some of that is because there are certain things that are required by Ohio law, and it just is. In order for us to make a document like this available. But, you know, we have an addendum. This is addendum 1. It's an instruction to honor my pro-life belief. And so you're welcome to use this form, or you're welcome to print it out and take it to your attorney and say, I want something like this. Or, you know, the attorneys can get in contact with them and we'll share them a version that's a little easier to customize with their clients. So that's it. It's real easy to remember. It's just faithfulattheendoflife.org.